It used to be that people took debate more seriously, and I think now it's more just an attempt to essentially wrangle the audience's emotions before the clock runs out. It's a very typical Christian apologist thing to do, is pick a quote that's so old that the audience doesn't even know that it's been completely refuted or superseded since then. But one of the problems of being a Christian apologist is that your bullshit detector is gone, right? Like you're not actually, like if you see something that supports your position, you just start saying, yeah, oh, excellent. You don't have this like, well, that's kind of weird. Scientists said that. So like in terms of structuring your debate, like this is a terrible way to structure an opening. You're setting yourself up for failure. Like this is very easy to dismantle this. He doesn't know that the methods of apologetics are themselves bankrupt. So he's actually taking them seriously as if this is a correct way to argue. This isn't the kind of thing that should be done in a live debate. Like it's basically trying to trick the opponent and the audience rather than be serious. Is this his own independent research, or is he getting it from some other Christian apologist who lined up these dominoes for him? Like, is he getting this from somewhere? That is just the most ridiculous argument that I've ever heard.
Welcome back, everybody. Today I am delighted and privileged to be joined by Dr. Richard Carrier. Dr. Carrier, a very warm welcome to the Wandering Sapiens channel.
Yeah, glad to be here again.
Yeah, it's fantastic to have you on. Thank you for joining me today. So last time we spoke, we discussed debating skills and how to analyze formal debate. And today is somewhat a follow-up in that we are going to talk about a debate that took place between Mike Jones and yourself in Nashville, Tennessee last November. So to start, could you please give us some overall context around that event?
Yeah, so I was brought in, it's modern day debate, as you see the icon on the thing. They brought me in originally to do a debate with Andrew Wilson on Christian nationalism, which I did. That was a terrible debate and definitely not worth the bother of analyzing, because it really, he didn't engage with the actual subject of the debate hardly at all. And then I did this debate at the same conference with Mike Jones, on also known as Inspiring Philosophy, on whether God exists. And this debate was more of a straightforward, typical debate. And so it's definitely, of the two debates you're going to bother to pay attention to, this is the one. And so we can analyze like what happened in this debate and what makes for good argument and bad.
Anyway, so we jump into the debate. So a non-trivial question as well, does God exist? And the speaker on the other side was Mike Jones, who runs a YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy, with 500,000 subscribers, which is not nothing. And it's dedicated to answering every popular objection to Christianity so that Christians are better equipped to defend their faith. He also has a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Arizona. Again, on this channel, we evaluate argument, and we make a clear distinction between the people and their arguments. I don't know Mike Jones, and even though I believe that most of his arguments are unconvincing, to put it mildly, that's the price to pay when you have the courage to defend your ideas publicly. So yes, we only focus on arguments, and there's no ad hominem here. So let's begin with Mike Jones' first introduction statement.
We are going to jump right into it. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here. I have the timer set for you, Mike, for your 15-minute opening statement.
All right, thank you, James, and thank you, Dr. Carrier, for agreeing to the debate. I'll be arguing that God does exist, and we have more than enough evidence to establish this. I'll present 3 arguments for God's existence, and then make an argument from parsimony. But first, I'm going to argue idealism is true, which in a nutshell is the belief that all is fundamentally mind. We can infer this from what I would call the introspective argument. Okay, premise 1, the mind exists. No one with a mind can doubt this. As Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Premise 2, the mind and the properties of mind cannot reduce to matter. The hard problem of consciousness exists for a reason. There is no path forward to explain how consciousness could emerge from matter. Plus, everything we experience is qualia. Take bundle theory, for example, which is that physical objects exist as bundles of properties. For example, you could describe an apple as red, round, shiny, smooth, and tasty. But if you remove these properties, what is left? Well, nothing really. But these are all mental experiences, not physical. As Susan Schneider says, Pure property ontologies need to take physical objects as metaphysically derivative, even objects that physics regards as fundamental. Objects are instead bundled out of properties, or they are properties. The atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel had to admit, if a mental event really is a physical event in the sense and nothing else, then the physical event by itself, once its physical properties are understood, should likewise be sufficient for the taste of sugar, the feeling of pain, or whatever it is supposed to be identical with. But it doesn't seem to be. It seems conceivable for any physical event. There should be a physical event without any experience at all. Experience of taste seems to be something extra continually related to the brain state. But we can't reduce the physical to the mental, because as we noted, everything we experience is mental. And using the logic of bundle theory and the binding problem, we can infer what constitutes as the physical can reduce to the mental. But as noted, the mental cannot reduce to the physical. Premise 3, substance dualism is false. As noted, there is no reason to posit a substance beyond the qualia we experience. And substance dualism suffers from issues like the interaction problem. Therefore, from the 3 premises, the conclusion would follow that all is mind, and that would mean idealism is true. If idealism is true, then our background knowledge makes it more likely that theism is true, and this will become apparent as I go through the 3 arguments. First, by God, I just want to say I mean a necessary immaterial mind whose nature would be ideal or absolute perfection. So the first argument is called the emergent universe argument. So
for those who have not seen the debate yet, they might be surprised by how technical it was. And you mentioned it a moment ago. A fair part of the debate was spent debating arcane questions at the intersection of highly speculative cosmology and metaphysics.
Yeah.
And so did you know that Mike Jones' narrative would follow such a path?
I was aware that he was pushing some of these ideas on his channel. I did not know that he would take this tack. Like, this is a bad move on his part. Like, this is like you're making it's like you're putting weights on yourself and trying to win a race. Like, you're making his job harder. But I can only defend theism if I defend this much less plausible thing, which is idealism, which, is kind of rejected by basically all philosophers now, even most theist philosophers. So anyway, it was a weird tack. I was ready for it because I've dealt with idealism before, and this largely gets into mind-brain physicalism, which I already had a whole section ready to debate because I figured that would come up. But I didn't think it would be like the actual foundational premise of his entire argument. So yeah, this whole idea that like it all comes down on that last slide, P2, which is that all of these mental properties cannot, like very importantly, has to be cannot reduce to matter. You can't even argue that it does not or hasn't been yet, because that doesn't accomplish his goal, because then I can just argue, well, it probably will, and here's all the reasons why. That's the trend in the evidence, is we're going to get to a complete physicalist explanation of mind eventually, and all the indicators are that we're going that direction. And then we're not there yet, but when we get to my opening, I kept it very simple, and I'll explain that when we get there, where I could keep hitting basic points of precedent, evidence, and simplicity of model. And I was ready to destroy this by hitting all 3 points in ways that I know he doesn't expect. But because this has been done before, right? Idealism has been refuted for hundreds of years, so this isn't like a new thing that's going to blindside me. But it was a strange choice on his part, so I was very curious to see where this was going.
Yes. He glosses over the extraordinary difficulties that go with adopting idealism. He doesn't. He's very quick to criticize. Some difficulties that come up with physicalism and naturalism, and that's fair enough. But to believe that idealism doesn't come with at least.
Right. Good point. Yeah, same with substance dualism. Like, the list of things he says are problems with substance dualism, there are equivalent problems for idealism.
Exactly.
But we weren't there to debate idealism, right? So I was going to focus on where we are with God, not burn clock on that stuff, because I didn't need to defeat that stuff, because I could defeat that one premise and that's enough. Idealism can't overcome that. So anyway, that's why I didn't go there. I didn't waste any time on this, but you're absolutely right. All of those rabbit holes exist here. There's a lot that's kind of, he's writing on a lot of assumptions here that are not well-founded.
And another thing before we continue is that it's my opinion that there's quite a bit of quote mining in his presentation. For instance, he mentions various people.
Well, Nagel just before, yeah.
Nagel, yes. And Nagel is an atheist. I mean, it's not that you can't take an argument made by an atheist and run it to to make your point, but he's quoting a book. I have the quote here. So he's quoting.
Oh yeah, good. Yeah.
And Cosmos. And it's true that Nagel, the author of a famous paper called "What Is It to Be a Bat?" or
Yeah,
something
right.
like
What is it like to be a bat?
what is it like to be a bat? And so he claims that our current physical theories are incomplete in as much as they can't explain consciousness and subjective experiences. But in the same book, he writes that he's an atheist, and he says, I am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. And so, again, you are perfectly entitled to take an argument made by an atheist and run it. But I think I wanted to point out that, yes, quote mining is, I think, one of the main problems with Jones' presentations, in my view.
Yeah, and just in terms of debate theory, this hits an example of the ways that oral debate kind of run counter to intellectual progress, like how why oral debate is bad. And if you take that like that would take a whole digression, right? Like, well, you're kind of taking Nagel out of context. Do you have arguments? Because Nagel has arguments against God despite that. So, like, are you going to take on his arguments? Like, from his perspective, are you going to take on his arguments against God, or are you just going to ignore them and use the quote? Now, I'm not a Nagelist. I wouldn't defend Nagel. I think he was wrong about a bunch of stuff, and it's actually quite old. This is another thing. This is a really old quote. And there's been tons of philosophy since then, and science since then has kind of refuted a lot of what he was saying. I mean, a lot of like the Daniel Dennett and other the following what do they call it? Multiple frames analysis and other computational and functionalist analysis of consciousness have gone way past Nagel. Like, Nagel's the super obsolete now. So this idea of using this old quote is another example. It's a very typical Christian apologist thing to do, is pick a quote that's so old that the audience doesn't even know that it's been completely refuted or superseded since then. And, you know, it's obviously, I don't have clock time to explain that, right? So I just have to let it go. Another thing is, like, I happen to know the backstory for Nagel and stuff, but what if I didn't? He could have picked some atheist philosopher that I hadn't read, put that quote up there, and I don't know the context of that quote. And so when you're in that live debate, like, how can I might be suspicious, and this has happened. I've been in debates where I've seen a quote come up, and I'm like, yeah, I think something's being left out here or misrepresented, but I can't stop the debate, check, and see, like, what they're leaving out or what game they're playing. I can't tell that because there's no way to do that under clock in a debate. So, like, that, it allows that kind of tactic to be played. And I think that undermines the value of debate. Like, there's no point in having this debate if we're going to play games, right? Like, why are we playing games? Why shouldn't we be trying to understand each other's position and why we believe what we do, rather than trying to game the audience? Like, that's an example of the kind of thing that I have a problem with. This is a milder case because this has been a standard Christian apologetic tactic since before the internet, right? Like, goes back to the 80s, like maybe before this. I mean, quote mining, frankly, goes back to the Scopes monkey trial. Like, it's a really old tactic, and we've been rolling our eyes at it for like decades now. But a lot of Christian apologists are kind of trained to do that. They just think that this is a normal and a correct way to argue, even in print. So I catch Christian apologists doing this thing in print where I have time to check, which is, like, the worst time for them to do this, but they still do it anyway. So that's an old tactic. That's not a new tactic, but it is an example of how you can use live debate to kind of, like, basically game the audience this way by giving that quote, but you're not really explaining the backstory. Well, was Nagel a theist? And if he wasn't a theist, why did this argument not convince him that there was a God? Like, what are we doing here? Like, why quote Nagel on this? Isn't there someone else he could quote that would be more suitable? Or does he even need to quote anybody? That's the other, like, the idea that you need an authority to like for some reason, because Nagel said it, that made it more persuasive. But why is it more persuasive when Nagel says it than when you say it? Like, you could just say it. It's either a good argument or not, right? Anyway, so this illustrates the way that oral debates can be used to sort of disingenuously manipulate the audience rather than genuinely look for the truth. So I wanted to give that point before we moved on. Now, I think Jones is being intellectually serious. I think his mistake is that he genuinely believes this is how you're supposed to argue, because that's how all other Christian apologists argue. So he's been trained as an apologist. He doesn't know that the methods of apologetics are themselves bankrupt. So he's actually taking them seriously as if this is a correct way to argue. So when he quotes Nagel, like, he thinks he's doing what you're supposed to do, he doesn't realize how that's actually kind of a disingenuous move and not really suitable in live debate, unless you're going to treat it correctly, where you're going to explain well, Nagel was still an atheist, here's why, or whatever, right? Like you got to do something with Nagel rather than just quote him out of context.
Yes, exactly. I think there's a lot of appeal to authority in his presentation. And we won't stop for every time he does that, but he does a lot of quote mining and giving quotes out of their context and without even once trying to establish a valid connection between what he said by physicist or philosopher and his point. So,
or how Nagel has been answered, right? Because you're picking a quote from like 50 years ago. A lot of stuff's gone on since then, right? So like you're not informing the audience. It's almost like as if he's acting as if, and this is how all Christian apologists behave. They're acting as if no one has heard this argument before. Like this is some sort of big surprise, a gotcha moment. It's like, actually, that's been refuted like 100 different times, or answered at least 100 different times. Like, so are you going to fill in the audience, or are you going to give the false impression that no one's ever answered this claim here? That's the thing that I find kind of disingenuous about it. But I think that's inherent in Christian apologetics. They're trained and taught to think that this is how you're supposed to argue. They don't see what you're pointing out, which is the inherently fallacious mode of argument that this consists of.
So if the universe is emergent, it's emergent from a mind. The universe is emergent, therefore the universe is emergent from a mind. Pretty simple. I'll start by defending the second premise. The common belief today is the universe is fundamentally like particles or something like quarks, but quantum field theory doesn't show that. Physicist Walter Schmidt says particles are actually waves in different types of fields. This goes for all the particles we are made of. We are all just made of waves in a field. What looks to us as a billiard ball on a billiard table is actually a bunch of waves moving from the cue to the pocket. Now, some try to say, well, everything might reduce to quantum fields, but that doesn't work either, as the philosopher of physics David John Baker notes, that many of the problems that particle interpretations have also apply to field interpretations. And as other experts have noted, Baker's conclusions are pretty decisive to this day. Now, this can get complicated, but in a nutshell, there are mathematical problems with saying quantum fields are underlying objects, like the inability to assign Fock space to quantum fields, and other issues like spontaneous symmetry breaking. As Baker concludes, it seems that in many ways, fields in particle interpretations must stand or fall together.
No, this illustrates everything. This is a really good example here. So remember, Jones's premise is that an emergent universe has to emerge from mind. So that's what he's trying to prove here. But to prove it, he skips. Now, he hasn't explained anything to the audience, so I think most of the audience has no idea what's going on here, but he jumps into the weeds. He goes off the rails into the weeds of the whole debate in physics between wave-particle duality and quantum mechanics without explaining any of that, without explaining the different sides, without explaining what Baker's position is. This is a really crucial thing, because Baker's position... No, I didn't know this at the time, because I'd not read this paper, so I don't know. He throws this up. I don't have time to go check... or even to do what I just did right now, which was to go online and very quickly check if Dave Baker is a superstring theorist, which is immediately, I was thinking, I'll bet Dave Baker is a superstring theorist. And so I didn't have time to do that in the debate. I did it right now and I checked, and yeah, he is. So he goes through this, he's quoting a bunch of Baker's paper. He's trying to make this point that you can't reduce reality to quantum fields. Therefore, that leaves mind, right? Okay, this is either I don't know if this is a very dishonest argument, or if Jones if someone has fed Jones this, or if he's just very naive, and so he's just quote mining Baker and not thinking about what is Baker's position, right? So if the field interpretation is wrong, if everything doesn't emerge from fields, what does Baker think it emerges from? Maybe he never thought to ask that question and therefore just blanked on the other half of Baker's paper where he answers this question. Or does Jones know that Baker solves this problem in a different way and he's just not telling us? But his argument depends on him not telling us, because if he were to tell us what half of Baker's paper, the paper he's showing right now, if he were to tell us what that argued, it would destroy his original argument, which is it has to emerge from a mind. So, because he's making the sort of elimination argument where he's saying it's either quantum fields or a mind. It's not quantum fields, therefore it's a mind. But that's a false dichotomy, etc. So anyway, when this came up, I just ignored it because I already knew I would just respond with superstring theory. I didn't need to address Baker itself because I could. And also, this is more wheel spinning because Jones is spending a lot of time quoting Baker rather than just making the point he wants to make. So saying well, it can't reduce to quantum mechanics. Here's a bunch of physicists who say so, or quantum fields. Sorry, you can't reduce the universe to quantum fields. here's a bunch of physicists who say so, therefore mind is the only thing left. That would be the same false dichotomy. It would be the same dishonest or fallacious argument, but it would cut a lot of the time out, and it would not have this, like you said, appeal to authority, where he's trying to make it seem to the audience as if Baker agrees with Jones, when Baker absolutely 100% does not agree with Jones. And now I know this debate, right? So I don't know if Baker's specific paper, but I know the debate, and I know the two sides. The two sides are it reduces to fields or it reduces to space-time. And the side that says it reduces that the universe emerges from space-time, so it's waves or string waves in space-time. And a complex space-time, but whatever. That's a getting into the weeds that the audience doesn't need to know. But I think I do that anyway later. I might jump into the Calabi-Yau space problem. But anyway, so I knew that, like, well, if Baker is against field interpretations of quantum field theory, then he must be a superstring theorist. That's my immediate thought. Now, I can't just say that in the debate because I don't have time to check and verify that my intuition is correct on that. So all I did is I just defended superstring theory, and that's fine. But just now, when you brought this up and reminded me of it, I had the time to go and check. And I was like, yeah, Baker's a well-noted superstring theorist. So Baker actually agrees with me in this debate, right? So he's saying, it all reduces to space-time, not a mind. So by not presenting the correct dichotomy here in this debate, the physicists are not debating between fields and God. They're debating between, or mind for that matter, they're debating between fields and space-time. But if you add up all the physicists who say it's fields and all the physicists who say it's space-time, that's all the physicists. So there's no authority now to cite for the elimination of everything except God. So this is a doomed argument. Like, Jones cannot succeed at this argument because all of the reality of the debates in physics undermine it completely, and I point that out later. But the key thing here is this: using Baker as this sort of distraction, as sort of straw man, is again another disingenuous move. It's not serious in the sense that, like, someone who is taking this seriously would want to know what is Baker's position, and it's certainly not Jones's position. So that would commit Jones, if he's going to cite Baker at all, it would commit Jones to then tackling Baker's position, which it reduces to space-time. And if he were to use the same method as he's using here, the only way he could do that is to cite the field theorist defenders and say, well, they say it's not space-time. I said, but that still doesn't get you to mind. It's because both sides would agree it's one or the other, right? So just saying there's a bunch of physicists who say it can't be space-time, a bunch of physicists say it can't be fields, therefore it can't be either, therefore it's God, is a disingenuous, fallacious argument, right? Because that's not how it works. Is all of those physicists would agree that if they're wrong, the other side is right. And so there's no way to get to mind through this argument. But Jones doesn't do that. He doesn't do it properly. He just uses this argument from authority, quote mining and stuff, and the false dichotomy to sort of push his argument to try and get universe can only be emergent from a mind. Anyways, I tackle this in my own way using the available clock time and the resources that I had at the podium. But this illustrates the point that you and I have been making up till now.
And the worst in all this is, so David Baker is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Michigan, and he's super approachable. I mean, his email is online, and you can ask him. He's doing a debate, and I'm going to use some of what you said in the paper. Do you think I'm going too far? Do you think I'm stretching it a bit? And he would answer. So
yes, right,
and so maybe we won't stop for. But I just want to mention so. Jones is going to quote Maynard Kuhlmann from Bielefeld University in Germany, and he argues that for algebraic quantum field theory, so which is again completely, he's not concluding from his work to idealism. He's saying that the fundamental description of reality may be given in terms of algebraic structures. So it's a type of structural realism. It's completely opposed to idealism.
Yeah.
But he doesn't care to mention that.
Yeah.
So, I think you're being very generous to Jones in saying that maybe he doesn't even realize that.
Right, yeah. No, I'm sympathetic to your position there. I am being a bit overgenerous, I'm sure.
Sure. Next slide. So just appealing to fields to escape the problems that show particles cannot be fundamental doesn't work because a lot of the same issues come up. Philosopher of science Meynard Kuhlmann notes physics lacks a coherent account of fundamental issues, such as the definition of objects. It's not at all clear what a particle or field even is. Quantum field theory doesn't suggest fields are entities. Instead, at the most fundamental level, we only find structures, relations, and properties, not a material substance there. So this is one reason physicist James Glatfelter says the very notion of materialism now appears misguided. Our worldview is shattered.
Actually, the quote that we see here from James Glatfelter is probably the only expert that would agree with Jones, I think, among the 10 or 12 experts that he cites. He's a physicist who argues for idealism, and is convinced that spiritual traditions, excuse me, especially from the East, non-Western traditions, have something important to say about the nature of consciousness. But yes, other than that, often the quotes are very much out of context.
Well, so again, I'm not. This is another example where I don't know Glatfelter, so I can't like rebut his arguments because I don't know what they are, and Jones isn't telling us what they are. So I just have to ignore this in the debate. It's like useless because he hasn't even told the audience what is Glatfelter right. Like he's just saying he says a thing, but like what's his argument to this conclusion? But one of the things my intuition gets raised by the fact that Glatfelter. Now, is this an English translation from? Did Glatfelter write in another language, and this is a translation into English?
No. I think he's an English speaking.
Okay, well then that matters more than that. So like he uses the word materialism. So as soon as I see any philosopher in the 21st century using the word materialism, non-ironically, I'm deeply suspicious that they know what they're talking about because that term has been completely rejected and replaced with physicalism. And there's a reason why it was replaced with physicalism, because physicalism includes something that materialism never thought to include, which is space-time, right? Because obviously that exists. So it's not everything is a material, because space and time are not a material. Materialism might have made sense back when ether theory was still a thing in the 19th century, but that was refuted. So like we're out of that now. So we've long since moved to physicalism. Materialism is an outdated word that no one uses except kind of half jokingly anymore. And so if he's using it seriously, like that tells me that he's either engaging in rhetoric here or he's not up on the latest philosophy of what he would call materialism, which is actually physicalism. And so again, we don't know what led to this quote too. Like the very notion of materialism now appears misguided. Based on what? Like what are the preceding sentences to this quote? There's no way for me to know that live in the debate because I can't check the book. There's no way for me to know what this quote even refers to, much less whether it refers to the same things Jones has been saying. And even if they do refer to the same things Jones has been saying, why have Glatfelter step in and repeat the thing that Jones just said? Like what is gained? What value is gained? Unless you want the audience to go read this book, maybe. But as you just pointed out, that wouldn't help because Glatfelter is not really defending the theism that Jones wants to do. So anyway, this is another example of that, which I can then come back at it with just standard physicalism and superstring theory. So when I'm making notes, it's like I don't need to respond to Glatfelter. I can just respond to the point Jones is making, and all of it falls down. Citing Glatfelter doesn't do any good at that point because it's basically de facto refuted by the alternative position.
Yes, and so my question would be, it took me like 15 minutes to research on the internet what the various people is mentioning are really arguing. So, well, why didn't he do that beforehand?
Yeah. Yeah, or if he did, or did he not even realize he was supposed to, right? And that is a good question. I often ask this question is where is this list of names coming from? Like, is this his own independent research, or is he getting it from some other Christian apologist who lined up these dominoes for him? Like, is he getting this from somewhere? Or did he do this on his own? And if he did it on his own, how did he find Glatfelter? Right? Like, I'm thinking, like, how did you locate this particular text? Did you read, like, a bunch of books about consciousness and reality? And if so, why are you only citing this one and not any of the other ones? Right? Like, I don't know, I just can't, it's difficult to picture, like, how he got to this position. And like you said, how he got to this position while still not realizing or not caring about what these guys actually argue and how that relates to his case. So yeah, I think that there is kind of this illustrates what the overall point, which is this is more like going out and finding quotes to mine to create an image of how things are that is not accurate in order to bolster his false dichotomy to get to his conclusion. It's all bogus methodology. And so that, like, to be charitable, the question is, like, does he really think that this is a valid way to argue? To be not charitable is to say, does he know that this is a con? Like, does he know that he's kind of snowing the audience here? I'm not telepath. I can't claim to know that, but I do see it looks similar. And I've seen both sides of this. I've seen Christian apologists using these tactics, actually thinking that they're correct. And I've run into Christians who are bald-facedly lying about things to try and influence the public. And they look and sound alike. So it's difficult to tell.
He has made a review on his channel, Inspiring Philosophy. So I'll include a link in the description if viewers are interested in that, but from what I understand, he didn't prepare entirely by himself, and he was helped by
gotcha.
And so, yeah. And in a few seconds, he's going to admit that he's citing quotes so many experts that it's obviously not something he made up. And so, yeah.
Shattered. Philosopher Jan Westerhoff agrees. The moral to draw from the reductionist scenario seems to be that either what is fundamental is not material, or that nothing at all is fundamental. And I'm citing so many experts so you're aware this is not something I made up. It's coming from experts in the philosophy of physics.
Sorry, what's the story on that last author who he quoted?
Hold on 1 second. That's Jan Westerhoff. He's a professor of Buddhist philosophy at Oxford University. And when you're trying to... I've looked at a few interviews he gave, and he's very, very cautious in making any inference. So, you can write to him David Baker. Literally, you can find his email.
So, is he himself a Buddhist?
Well, that's the point. He's very cautious in coming.
Okay.
He's very interested in it, but he's very interested. He seems to be convinced that Buddhism has something interesting to say, but he doesn't go as far as to present himself as Buddhist.
Yeah, because Buddhist idealism doesn't require a god, right? So that
Right.
creates a new lemma that Jones has to eliminate to get to God, right? Well, even if you defend idealism, there are atheistic idealisms that now you have to topple. But I don't even know why you're bothering defending idealism to begin with. But if you're going to do that, it doesn't go automatically to God. And there's another example where if he's not even discussing what philosophy of this guy he's quoting actually presents a challenge to Jones's dichotomy, then he needs to address it if he's going to quote it, right? Or at least acknowledge that there's a problem that he has to overcome and then do something to overcome it. But no, instead, like we keep pointing out, that he one-sidedly quotes them and just ignores the actual positions they take that actually undermine his case overall.
Yes, and making outlandish claims out of extracts from papers or from...
Yeah, and I think the argument that you point out where he says, I'm citing so many experts that it's not made up.
Yeah.
Two problems with that. Like one is, yeah, but if this is 1% against 99%, what does that say to your position, right? Like if 99% of physicists think these guys are jokers, then, which is not the case, but it's close to the case because he mixes up a bunch of different people with different perspectives. And the other side of that is, like, you take Baker, for example, is a superstring theorist who actually takes the position that I'm going to take in the debate. So like you're like picking a bunch of guys who have a different perspective from each other, much less. So they're not really, he's not citing a bunch of experts who are proving that Jones's position is not made up. It's difficult, like there's an ambiguity as to what the position is that he's talking about is not made up. If he's like Baker's not an idealist, so what's the position? Is it idealism? Is it that you can't reduce reality to a physical entity? But then Baker's against you on that. And so what is the thing? And so it creates this sort of ambiguity as to what it is he's citing these experts for. So first of all, he's citing a minority of experts against the majority, and the other side of that is that he's not explaining how do we get to where, or what the thing is that he's citing all these experts for. But it gives the impression, because of the ambiguity, that he's citing it for his only God, the universe can only emerge from a God position. So he's kind of giving the impression that he's citing all these experts defending Jones's position on God, rather than this sort of subordinate premise. But then which subordinate premise? Like, he's not clear. And I think that's sort of misleading thing to do, which, even if it's sincere, it's an illustration of doing this badly. This is a poor presentation if you're not articulating clearly what you mean when you say things. So what does Jones mean when he says a bunch of experts support what? They support what thing? And if he'd said, then the statement might have become false, because if he said they support mind-first ontologies, and say, well, Baker doesn't, so that's false, right? Anyway, so there's a lot going wrong there, and I think it's very avoidable. There's no reason for Jones to have used any of these tactics to make his argument. He could have saved all this time and just spoke like 3 sentences to establish his actual position, and then wait for me to respond, and then he would respond, etc., and then we would debate that. But no, he's burning all this clock, citing all these authorities, but it's wheel spinning mostly. Like, he's not really getting anywhere with this.
Essentially, our macro reality appears to be emergent from underlying information, not fundamental objects that we can call fields or particles, thus supporting the second premise. Now, as for the first premise, if all of material reality can reduce to mathematics, properties, and abstractions without any reference to a substance, then it can better fit with an idealist worldview, where the macro reality is merely emergent from information contingent on mind. Instead of posing an undetectable material substance that gives rise to quantum fields and particles and then somehow builds conscious agents, we stick with what we know exists, consciousness and a material reality reducible to information. So shave off all mind-dependent objects and stick with what we know. Similarly, philosopher Doreen Fraser has to say about our reality, multiple lines of argument support the conclusion that quantum field theory does not describe a world that contains particles as fundamental entities. These arguments rely on special relativistic or general relativistic premises. I've added the proposal that particles be considered fictions in another sense. Particles and quasi-particles in condensed matter physics supply physical intuitions that are useful for formulating mathematical framework for quantum field theory, but which do not represent the world even approximately.
So again, Doreen Fraser, her email is online. She's a philosopher from the University of Waterloo in Canada. And she does work on the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics. But from what I understand, she seems to, if not endorse, at least go along with some kind of scientific realism. And nowhere does she imply that her work gives credence to idealism. So
yeah, my again, so like I don't know her. This is kind of random. You're picking some professor that I've never heard of from Waterloo, right? So like this is another example of that. Like, I can't stop and go check what the context of this argument is. And I'm not going to burn clock speculating about that either. I don't need to bother. I can just go right to superstring theory and knock all of this out. But when I read that quote, my intuition is it sounds like this comes from a discussion of epistemology, not ontology, where her argument is not that there isn't anything down there. Her argument is that we don't currently have access to what it is, so we should only talk about the mathematical abstraction. So we should just talk about the math, not because it reduces to math, but because we don't know what it reduces to, but we do know at least the math, right? So we can observationally just describe what's going on using certain mathematics, and so we can actually use the math without committing to an ontology. That's what it sounds like to me, but there's no way for me to know to see like what is the preceding sentence or the following sentence. What even is a chapter title? Like he's quoting it's a companion to the philosophy of physics. What entry is this from? What's the title of that entry, right? Like that's what I would want to know so that I would know what's she talking about. Also, since this is a companion to the philosophy of physics, usually what happens when an author has a chapter, they don't take an ideological position. They describe all of the positions, right? So like I would expect whatever article this is where she's saying, well, so-and-so says this and so-and-so says that, and I say this, where she's not going to make it look like she's refuted everybody. She's just going to give her opinion, but she's also going to present all these other opinions. Why don't we hear what those opinions are? Like, what is that chapter even about, right? Like, so that's all that's going on in my mind. I'm like, well, I can't answer any of those questions because I'm sitting here at a podium and I don't have time to go find the book, this obscure book. These are expensive, by the way. These Routledge companions are usually pretty pricey, so they're hard to find. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what this is, but like I said, my intuition tells me that he's getting this out of context here, especially if there's an ellipsis. Always be on the alert when there's an ellipsis in the middle of a quote, because that's like what's in the ellipsis, but also what's before and after this, what's the chapter, etc. So yeah, this illustrates the point that we've been making.
So no need to posit some sort of substance beyond that. We stick with an idealist ontology. Mind is fundamental, and the physical is just information or qualia. Next, we can use another correlation using quantum cognition, and this will be an inductive argument. In 2009, physicist Diedrich Erch published a paper noting that our cognitive processes can be readily modeled using the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics. Now, this is not just hypothetical. Psychologists have been applying quantum cognition to their field and finding it is more successful than traditional models, and has provided principled answers to the puzzles and challenges.
Jones is giving the impression that this paper argues that somehow supports his idealism position, that somehow quantum mechanics somehow creates consciousness or something like that. Because he's very much seeing like there's somehow that the quantum mechanics and consciousness are interrelated. Therefore, this gets to idealism. He doesn't really articulate the connection, like how you get there. This kind of like pop psychology, sort of standard woo internet stuff about how, quantum mechanics, therefore idealism. But that's fundamentally misunderstands what Wang argues, because Wang is not arguing that consciousness is quantum mechanical. He's arguing that it's classically mechanical, but he's saying that the mathematical equations for superposed states, right? There's a lot of, and because quantum mechanics uses matrix mechanics, and it uses a lot of mathematics that deal with having there being two discrete states and being undecided between two different states, and then resolving those states. But that's exactly what a computer does. A classically mechanical computer, not a quantum computer. A classically mechanical computer can be in a state of being undecided between two things, and then it has to collapse its decision. It has to choose one or the other. And the human mind does, and this is especially the case for neural net computing. So like the human mind physically works that way, where we can be in a superposed state of believing and disbelieving a thing, but we can't stay in that state. It has to collapse. We have to pick a side. And then the mathematical processes that our neurons use to collapse the state resemble the processes that collapse wave functions into particle states. But they're not saying that they are the same thing. This is very important. That Wang is a traditional physicalist. Like he's saying that consciousness is a classical mechanical problem. It's not a quantum mechanical problem. He's just saying that you can adapt a lot of the math from both domains because the processes are very similar. And this is the case in a lot of things. There's a lot of, like, you could talk about wave mechanics as you show in a physics class where they use actual water and they do a double slit experiment using water, right? That's a classical system. That's not a quantum system, but it obeys you can manipulate the system so that it behaves exactly like quantum mechanics shows. And we've done this with more things. Like we can do like quantum mechanical effects and superposition with phonons, with like sound, and like there's a lot of things that we can do like this. But that does not mean that it's quantum mechanical, right? So like this So it seems like he's presenting this to support the woo view of this, which is the bullshit that comes up in my title of my blog. But my blog, actually, it says, I think, what it says, quantum consciousness is bullshit, but quantum cognition is not. That's the title. That you'll see the slide, this next slide. Is that the key thing there? Notice what's the title of Wang's paper: quantum cognition, not quantum consciousness, right? So Wang is supporting me, not Jones. But Jones is presenting Wang as if he's refuting me. Right. And yet Jones knows my article because he shows it on the screen. So how does he not know this? Because this is all I talk about in there is Wang's position and how quantum cognition makes sense as a classical mechanical problem. And quantum consciousness is bullshit. How does he not know what my thesis is and that it applies to Wang if he knows the article? Did he not read the article? That's I don't know what to do with this. Right. It was a very strange thing to happen. That's why I was very curious to revisit what were his exact words when he brought up my slide. It doesn't sound like he says anything substantive, so it's not clear to me why he brought my slide up. I wonder if he just threw that slide in like 5 minutes before the presentation because someone told him about it, but he didn't read it. I just don't know what's going on here.
Yes, and well, you've articulated perfectly clearly, because for our viewers, quantum cognition is a branch of cognitive science that thinks that mathematical tools from quantum theory, like Hilbert spaces, are useful to model cognition, essentially. But they are talking about the mathematical tools. They are not saying cognition is like... and so sharing a mathematical formalism does not imply a shared ontology. And that's very critical to understand. For instance, another mathematical framework which is useful to model cognition is Bayesian mathematics. And Bayes' theorem is also very useful in studying for instance, population dynamics or the theory of natural selection, and biologists don't make the inference that, or rather, neuroscientists who are using again the mathematical framework of Bayes' theorem, they aren't implying that it's some sort of natural selection going on in the brain. So again, yes, it's not because you use the same mathematical framework then you share an ontology. And I think it's just saying, well, there's this field called quantum cognition. Quantum mechanics is at the base of what we know. Therefore, the universe emerges from some sort of a brain, which is completely.
Well, he never presents that syllogism, by the way. I don't think it comes up. He skips to the next step. That syllogism is bonkers. It doesn't make any. It's not even like formally valid. Like I don't even know. Like I can't even. I understand like the implications he's trying to push on the audience, but I don't know what the syllogism is by which he's getting you can't just say quantum consciousness. Therefore, the mind is below everything. You would need an argument from that, right? Like it's even quantum consciousness people like Penrose. Like Penrose is not an idealist, so like Penrose is a standard physicalist, but he's a quantum consciousness guy. So like, how do you go from quantum consciousness? Well, first of all, quantum consciousness is bogus. So you're already you're saddling yourself with another improbable, weird fringe topic to try and defend to get all the way back to the emergent thing has to be a god, or it has to be a mind and therefore a god. Like it's another kind of bad move. But also, it's not enough to just say quantum consciousness, therefore mind is fundamental. There's got to be some sort of argument that gets from one to the other. What is his argument? He never says. He just sort of like juxtaposes them and hopes as if by magic the conclusion comes. But so he presented no argument, so there wasn't really any argument for me to argue against, because I didn't know what his argument was. And so I tackle it eventually by just going through standard mind-brain physicalism and doing with superstring theory for quantum mechanics and so on. So I already had my prepared defeaters. I didn't need to get into the weeds of trying to figure out what his argument even is. But this is another example of that. This is arguing badly. Like this is a muddled argument. He's gotten the paper exactly wrong that he's citing. He's misrepresenting to the audience what Wang's position is and what my position is, and therefore what follows for Jones's position. Like, it's just a mess at this point. And yeah, like, there's not a lot of notes I'm writing because at this time, like, I'm like, well, my opening just does all this in. I don't know why I need to do any specific attacks on these people. I don't need to go and read these papers. But again, like, if you're going to rely on papers like this and not really explain them, then that is an example of, like, you're basically cheating the clock. You're like saying that, well, this guy proves a thing, therefore I'm right. But if that's your argument, I have to go read the paper to be able to argue with what your argument is, because you've buried it offline in this paper that you're citing. And that's just bad form in a live debate. It's more manipulative than sincere. Like, this is a disingenuous way to argue in a live debate. In a written debate, it would make more sense, because then your opponent could go read the article and then produce a useful, meaningful reply. But in oral debate, this is not how you argue. This is not an intellectually productive way to argue.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think you did the right thing in not burning clock in responding that. But I think for the sake of the audience, it's important to really be familiar with that type of thing. First, you start with a scientific fact, then you have a loose interpretation of it, then a philosophical leap, and then a theological conclusion. And so yeah, I'm not sure if he's doing that because he hopes that it will be convincing when it's watched afterwards online.
Right.
Or is he really playing the game of the
challenges? My opponent knows that quantum cognition is independent from quantum mind research, and he's endorsed the field recently. However, the point I'm getting at is that if our inner mental world can be modeled in terms of quantum processes, similar processes that give rise to space, time, and matter, that means space, time, and matter are emergent from the underlying quantum world, but our inner mental world of consciousness and mind can be modeled via quantum processes. Through the study of quantum cognition, this would suggest that what space-time emerges from would be similar or indistinguishable from that of a mind, or something that looks and acts an awfully lot like a mind. But I'd say the most parsimonious explanation is the universe is just emergent from a mind, instead of it emerging from something that isn't a mind, yet resembles and acts like a mind.
So we are pretty close to the syllogism that you were implying you didn't use. He actually uses it.
Well, there still isn't one, really, right? So, like, I mean, it's still confusing as to how he's getting the conclusion from the premises.
Yeah,
there's a lot of leaps here.
There's something called quantum cognition, and it seems like the universe...
Yeah, he doesn't explain the difference. Yeah. Everything we just said before, like, he's not telling the audience this. So, but also, even apart from that, like, he's still not connecting quantum... Everything's emergent from quantum mechanics. So now he's taking the position of field theory, fundamental field theory versus superstring theory. And then he's saying everything comes from that, therefore it comes from a mind. But wouldn't it be the other way around? Like, if everything comes from quantum fields, then don't minds emerge from quantum fields rather than the other way around? How does he flip the table upside down? I'm not seeing the argument. Like, how is that supposed to happen? It's just sort of like hand waved here.
In private correspondence with one researcher in this field, he said it could all just be a coincidence, but the correlations, i.e. the similarity in behavior between human concepts interacting with human minds and quantum entities interacting with fermionic matter, could be caused by the fact that both entities share the same conceptual nature.
Private correspondence. I can't rebut a private correspondence. I don't know what the previous sentence of the following sentence is. I couldn't even search it if we were doing a written debate. Like, without giving the whole discussion, I don't know what this quote is from. I don't know what he's talking about. So this is a classic example of bad form in a debate. Like, you absolutely should not be quoting private correspondence unless you can present the whole thing or make the whole case, explain the whole context of it. So this is useless to me, and this is definitely kind of dirty pool from a debate perspective. I've seen similar things where, like, there's a particular Christian apologist who was debating Bart Ehrman about the resurrection. And he cites personal correspondence that said that, well, we have a 1st century manuscript of Mark. I have a private correspondence from so-and-so who says so. And it's like, Ehrman's like, what can I do with that? I've never heard of this, right? Like, and I'm literally an expert in manuscripts. And so if I've not heard of this, like, you can't just sit there and cite, like, a private thing. I can't check if that's even valid or what you're talking about. It's very bad form. Now, it turned out, of course, everything that his opponent said was false, which is the problem with this, is that you have this quote from Bianchi, well, who is Bianchi, and why are we quoting him, and what's this quote from? What's he talking about? And I can't even from the quote figure that out, because he's talking about the entities share the same conceptual nature. Well, what does he mean? Does he mean minds and he's talking about quantum entities interacting with fermionic matter? Is he talking about minds and quantum entities? Like, what are the entities that share conceptual nature right here? It looks like he means quantum and fermionic, but which would not get to Jones's conclusion. But I can't tell if that's what Bianchi's talking about, nor can I tell what Bianchi's argument would be if that is what he's talking about. So this is kind of a useless quote. There's no explanation of why this is even here.
This can also be strengthened through the research in quantum mind theory, which I don't have time to cover now. But we can also look at the work of astrophysicist Franco Vazza and neurosurgeon Alberto Felitti, who wrote a paper.
I have to pause there.
Oh, this is the bonkers stuff that I thought was coming sooner.
I think Franco Vazza is an astrophysicist at the University of Bologna. Alberto Felitti is a neuroscientist at the University of Verona. And what's funny is that, again, in literally 2 minutes of research on Google, you can find that both have stated their wish for their research to stay in the scientific field and to avoid at all cost speculative uses of it. And if I may, I'd like to share a portion of an interview.
Well, about this, let me point out that, we got so many feedbacks after we published this paper. Most of them were very, scientific and deep into the matter, but some comments were completely out of topic. So some people took our results to justify, some creationist theories or new age point of view. Well, I want to point out that this has nothing to do with our work. So these are just interpretations. We didn't mean to justify creational, theories or metaphysics or something. Some people even thanked us to have shown the existence of God. This is not our aim. Of course, we want to keep this topic in a scientific field. So I think this is an important message to deliver.
Yeah, good.
So, again, it took me 2 minutes to find this on the internet. So my question is, why didn't Jones do that as well? Because he does exactly what the researchers, the scientists in question, are not wanting people to do with their work. So,
I think it's even worse than that, really. Right? So, because it would be one thing if they wrote a paper that people were misunderstanding, and then it didn't occur to you to go check to see if the authors pushed back against those interpretations. Like, obviously that would have been good. Had he done that, he would have realized. And in fact, I mean, this is the other thing, is like, if one of the problems of being a Christian apologist is that your bullshit detector is gone, right? Like, you're not actually, like, if you see something that supports your position, you just say, excellent. You don't have this, like, well, that's kind of weird. Scientists said that. And then you would want to make sure you understood what they were saying, or find out what other scientists were saying about it. And then maybe through that research, you would find Foletti's comments. Like, I didn't when I went searching. I just read his paper and found that it's not that. And in fact, it was exactly what I thought it was, because I had read similar reports and studies earlier, and I mentioned that later on. But I was trying to get that back to see what actually is in that paper. So I brought it up. Self-organization of complex systems. Principles of network dynamics. Yeah. Okay. Thermo.
Well, essentially, that's exactly what you say in your rebuttal. But
correct.
Again,
and that's why I say it's worse than that, because this suggests that Jones didn't even read their paper, or if he did, he didn't understand any of it. Yeah. And maybe they didn't use the exact same words that I do, and maybe that confused him. I don't know, but we're talking about the same thing. So we're talking about it's heat dissipation in network systems, and I don't know if they don't use thermodynamics as a word in their paper, but that's what they're talking about. Like, if you're reading, they're talking about systems and distribution of energy and things like that. But
they're saying that two fields of research like astrophysics and neuroanatomy coming together can be fruitful, but nowhere in their paper or subsequent publications do they imply any metaphysical consequences. And once again, Jones is entitled to take that and run with it and say, well, I understood your work better than yourself.
No, it's even worse. I mean, yes, that's true. But it's even worse. It's even worse than that, because like their paper is about explaining this, right? Like, so they're not like just making the observation and going, isn't that weird? And then walking off. Like their paper is explaining it, right? They have an explanation, and the explanation is not, you're looking at the brain of God, right? Like their explanation is, this is a common behavior in classical systems. When you have network systems interacting, we see many different versions of this. And so like the same kind of process is going on in the organization of neurons in the brain that is going on in the collapsing into filaments of galaxies. So they're actually explaining this without a God or without saying it's a mind or anything like that. They're not saying that the galaxies are a giant brain. They're actually saying the opposite of that. And so if you actually just read the paper, you would get a completely different conclusion. But no, he doesn't tell the audience what these guys are actually saying causes this effect. Right, so he's just saying, "Oh, look, isn't this weird? Even these experts say it's weird. Therefore," and then he's going to make this. He's going to go on and make the really weird, freaking Bigfoot type argument out of this. That really astonished me that he made this argument, because it is very much on the order of flat earthism or other kinds of like super bizarre bumblebees can't fly kind of thinking that I did not expect suddenly to show up in what had been otherwise kind of a sophisticated presentation, but then it becomes this like really like lowbrow internet conspiracy theory kind of stuff. And I was in my mind at the time, I was thinking like, oh my God, how am I going to unpack this underclock? Like this is so off the rails. Like it's going to take a while to pull this train back in to explain what's going wrong here. But, I made a note, and I knew what to do, because I knew I'd read the papers on this before. I didn't recognize this one, but I had read it before. And so I was aware of and there were many papers, by the way, on this. So, like, if you'd researched this, there's a lot of discussion of it in physics, and it all, like, states in different words in different ways what Finetti's argument actually was. So, like, if you actually checked, you would not be confused. So that's why I just wonder, like, did someone just give him the paper to put in his thing, and he never actually read the paper, right? Like he thinks, oh, this is a gotcha thing I can throw in here. Isn't that neat? Which is the worst possible way to argue in live debate. This is an example of why live debate is just failing now. It's not being intellectually useful, because people are reduced to doing this sort of showmanship stuff rather than actually doing substantive research and presenting a substantive position that actually accurately reflects the research that you did. But anyway, we're really getting to it now. So we're going to see, even people who are watching us, you and me right now, do this and haven't seen this debate, I suspect that they don't even realize what the next few slides are going to argue, but we're getting there, so we'll see.
Who wrote a paper on the similarities between neural networks and the cosmic web of galaxies. And they show that the properties of neural networks within the human cortex are similar to the cosmic web of galaxies, something we would expect if the universe is emergent from a mind. This is less likely if physicalism is true, but it would be predicted by idealism. Because, as philosopher of mind Bernardo Kastrup notes after drawing on their works, brains are the images or representations of conscious minds. Elsewhere, he says a brain, or the whole body by extension, is just the external appearance of a conscious agent. If the universe is emergent from a mind, we would expect the universe would in some way be the external appearance of that conscious agent, in the way your brain, on idealism, is the external appearance of you. So we have good reason to support the first premise as well. Now, as for the second argument,
that is just the most ridiculous argument that I've ever heard. And like, I was like, are we serious? Is he actually making this argument that, okay, so I'm going to be charitable and try and produce, because he doesn't produce a syllogism, but he kind of states one in his words. But it's basically like, if idealism is true, then brains are manifest by the submind. Like the mind entity is projected into the physical world in this form. Like somehow the mindedness causes brains to form in the way they do, like causes neurons and synapse networks. And therefore, if that's true, then therefore we should expect the universe, if there's a mind underneath the universe, it should manifest in the universe as a giant neuron network with synapses and stuff. And then he shows pictures of like, oh, look, I'm vindicated. As if he doesn't even know what a neuron or a synapse is or does, and that it doesn't do any of the same things that the nodes of galaxy filaments do. Like there's no I/O system, there's no glia cells, there's no signals transporting, there's no computation going on here that's organized and coherent. But also like it's a fallacy, right? Like to say that well, then I guess since everything comes from a mind, everything should look like a brain. Like my car should look like a brain, the trees in my yard should look like a brain. Like I don't understand like why only galaxies should look like a brain, or why that would need to be the case. Like none of this makes any sense, right? But of course, if you flip it back around from the argument you're supposed to be arguing against, which is physicalism, We have a much better explanation of why the brains are constructed out of neurons, why the glial cells are there, why the synapses are connected the way they are, why there are synapses at all, why the brain is organized in the sort of convoluted folds of the cortex, why the networks are set up that way, because these are like physically efficient ways to do that, right? And one of the things that brains have to do is dissipate heat effectively, or else they melt, right? So that's one of the things they do. Now, galactic filaments are also dissipating heat, so they're also collapsing into similar patterns of structure, but they're not doing so for the same purpose. They're not organizing. There's no genetic code that is telling them to assemble in just the right way so that you get coherent thought out of it. No, that's happening in us, right? Our synapses and neurons are being built by genes. It's actual whole mechanical, chemical computer is assembling them. So it's not a projection from the submind of the universe that is sort of just spontaneously causing the neurons to be organized the way they are. That's not. We know exactly why they're organized this way. We know the mechanics all the way down to the chemistry and all the way down to the actual coded program for building these machines and so on. So we know we have a full explanation, and it's not that, right? So and then again, there's no equivalent mechanism producing galactic filaments. They look similar because there's a similar thermodynamics going on. And that's it. That's the only similarity between them. And that's what Finetti himself is arguing. And many other scholars who've written on this are arguing the same point. It's this shows an interesting thing about thermodynamics and network systems. They're not talking about what Jones is talking about. So he's just flipped off the rails entirely there. And even if you were to construct a syllogism, try to charitably build one, it would be completely fallacious. It wouldn't make any sense.
Yes, it's not uncommon in nature to find similar structures. For instance, galaxies and hurricanes are logarithmic spirals, and it's also the case for matter around black holes. But that doesn't entail that hurricanes are black holes,
right? And also, let's remind people: neurons are not logarithmic spirals. Right? Yeah, so the galaxies are supposed to be the same things as the neurons, but they're completely wildly different. So that refutes the projection model, right? Somehow the subbrain is projecting a neural network onto the galaxies, but there aren't even neurons in the galactic filaments. They're galaxies. They're hurricanes, not organized cellular architecture. Anyway, we keep going on and on about this, but this was just a bonkers argument. I just don't know why he's convinced by this, or if he isn't, and he thinks somehow he can convince other people of this. I don't know. It is a profoundly scientifically illiterate argument that takes me literally back to Scope's monkey trial scale, ignorance of how science works or how you're even supposed to be doing this in this kind of debate. So this was really his deepest fail. It's just crashing and burning at this point.
That's essentially a fallacy, an analogy fallacy, because A and B are similar in some respects. Therefore, it's implied that they are similar in other respects, and that's not a valid inference. And as you mentioned, fractals in your rebuttal, because the way lungs and trees or root systems are organized, and maybe they share some mathematical framework, that doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that they share a common ontology.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word fractals. There's a whole science of this, and that's also another word for the same thing that we're talking about. And Finetti would agree. We're talking about fractal structures and how they form. And this is an example where I think Jones doesn't know that. I don't think he's put the two together, that we're talking about fractals, or that we're talking about thermodynamics, or that we're talking about dissipative systems. He doesn't know what any of those things are and how they all refer to the same. They're all words for the same, or manifestations of the same kind of phenomenon. So he doesn't know what he's talking about, and that's it's really hard to imagine on the fly. I'm sitting there trying to figure out how am I going to explain this under clock when he's laid no foundation for the audience to even understand any of the basic science that's going on here. It was challenging.
Start here. It's called it's a consciousness argument. Premise 1: contingent minds have either a personal explanation or a natural explanation. Theories of mind will fall into one of these two categories, or a mix, I guess you could suppose. And by personal explanation, I mean that if our consciousness cannot be reduced to natural processes or parts, and is irreducible as is, then it must come from a personal source. Premise 2, idealism is true, and thus all is reducible of mind. There are various ways I could argue for this. I refer you to the prior arguments, but for the sake of time, I need to move on. So this would mean that if all is mind, one's individual consciousness cannot be reduced to natural parts or processes that are not mental in nature, therefore, conclusion 1, a natural explanation cannot be the reason for contingent minds. Premise 3, the explanation of contingent conscious minds is a personal explanation, and then the source would be a necessary personal source. Idealist philosophers seem to be recognizing this fact one way or another. Bernardo Kastrup says the whole universe is a mind, but not in your individual psyche alone, for mind extends far beyond the boundaries of personal introspection. Helen Yetter Chapel says external reality is a vast unity of consciousness, independent from all finite minds.
So I just want to mention Helen Yetter Chapel, associate professor of philosophy at the University of Miami. And it's interesting for the audience to show that in like half an hour of research, you can find massive inconsistencies in Jones' arguments. And it's just basically a confirmation bias all the way down. For instance, here with Helen Yetter Chapel, the quote he's mentioning is actually from an article titled "Idealism Without God" in the book in which she contributed, and her most recent book is "Realist Idealism Without God." So, no, I think it's interesting that Jones doesn't mention that.
And again, how would I know this, right? There's no way for me to know this. He's responsible for telling us this. So by leaving that information out, it does look like bad form. You know, you might suggest possibly deception is going on here. But that's another example. Like if that's, and that was another point that I was going to make, is that he created this false dichotomy between personal and natural. He never really explained what natural meant. Like I think he was kind of using my definition without giving it, which is that everything is reducibly non-mental, would be natural. But he violates the law of excluded middle by including the third option, which is that it's neither natural nor personal, which would be the kind of thing that you just mentioned, that apparently she argues. I would list like Taoism is an example of this, and there are other kind of like spiritual force theories where there's no like central mind, there's no God. There's, well, like Buddhist view is that like mind is fundamental and individual consciousnesses emerge from that, but they emerge naturally from that by the nature of the consciousness field or whatever. There's no singular mind. There's no intelligence guiding any of that. There's no God in the system, but it's also non-natural. It's a supernaturalist system. So you can have this sort of idealism without God, right? Like that. So, but he hasn't eliminated that third position. And of course, that I could have burned clock on that, but that's kind of silly when it's just easier to spend the time that I have defending physicalism, because I can just defend that and I don't have to waste time pointing out that, oh, well, by the way, there's this third position that he left out that he also was obligated to refute but didn't, but that I'm not going to defend because I don't believe it. But nonetheless, it's logically available and he does have to eliminate it. And it becomes important when he's committing to idealism. Since I'm not committed to idealism, I don't need to talk about the various versions of idealism. But he does. If he's going to say idealism is true, therefore God, then he is obligated to prove that idealism leads to God and not to these non-God versions of idealism. But he doesn't mention that anywhere. And now, of course, I could have brought that up, but I was just using my clock time to do a more effective, efficient target to all this stuff. And I was going to point out that like he doesn't really need to name like all these quotes. Like this is just wasted clock here. Like there's no function for this other than to try and dazzle the audience. It's like emotional manipulation to say, oh, argument from authority, yeah. But if he's not going to present any of this, he could be using this clock time actually defending his argument rather than doing this, like this wasting time, because I don't need to answer any of these people. I can just ignore this. Like this is pointless. All I've got to do is show that his statement that mind cannot, he's committing to cannot, not has not, but cannot be reduced to parts that are non-mental. I can totally defend that it can be, right? Like conceptually, it is entirely possible that it reduces to non-mental parts. And then that's easy. And once I've done that, all this other stuff goes away. None of it adds to his case. None of it survives review at that point. So I can just pick the premise, that one premise that mental things cannot be reduced to non-mental things. That's all I need. And yet he burns like 5 minutes of clock on all this song and dance. But really, he's only said one thing that I can easily refute by just going right at that one premise, which is what I'll do. So like in terms of structuring your debate, like this is a terrible way to structure an opening. You're setting yourself up for failure. Like this, it's very easy to dismantle this. It could have done better by just spending more time defending his actual premise substantially so that there's more things for me to respond to. But he didn't do that. So that's not what's going on here.
But this would lead to a theistic conclusion. If all is mind and yet we are individually contingent, then we still must come from somewhere, but we as conscious agents are irreducible to smaller parts that make up our consciousness. It would reasonably follow our minds come from a greater mind that is the grounding of all contingent minds. Therefore, this is who we would call God, therefore God exists.
So between P3 and P4 is the fallacy that we were just talking about, where he goes from P3 straight to P4, but he has not eliminated the third option, which is non-theistic idealism. So this actually is an invalid syllogism. There's no premise that gets from P3 to P4, right? Like P4 is just this basically circular argument. He's just asserting, well, it's what we would call God. Well, not in non-theistic idealism. They don't call it God. And if you did call it God, it's basically just another form of atheism. You're just playing games with what the word God means. So yeah, that's where the mistake is in the syllogism, and he's blown right past it.
Now, the final argument I'll present is the moral argument. Premise 1, non-natural moral realism is true. This is the view that moral facts exist objectively and are not reducible to natural properties like happiness or anything in nature. They cannot be natural because of issues like the is-ought problem or G.E. Moore's open question argument. Something that is in nature is not evidence of something we ought to do. But as numerous philosophers note, moral realism is intuitive, and the way that moral values and duties manifest in reality implies they are objective. So, moving on, premise 2. If objective moral values and duties exist, they are personal in nature. Take moral prescriptions. They do not exist in physical nature. The natural world only contains descriptions. Prescriptions exist between minds. I could prescribe you the task of guarding me at this event. But that prescription exists between two minds. So if we are bound to objective prescriptions, that implies they come from a prescriber. As Peter S. Williams says, I have moral obligations, but since I can't be obligated by anything non-personal, e.g. the evolutionary history of my species, I must be obligated by something personal. Since there are objective moral obligations that transcend all finite persons or groups thereof, there must therefore be a transcendent personal reality to whom we are fundamentally obligated. Take the moral ideal. If there is an objective moral ideal, you will picture an agent who always acts right and is perfectly virtuous. But that is necessarily an agent, not mere abstract principles divorced from something personal. If there is an objective ideal, it would be a perfect moral agent. From a perfect mind would come perfect principles of behavior. Take moral guilt. Peter S. Williams says, since it would be inappropriate to feel guilt or shame before an abstract, impersonal moral principle, and since it is appropriate to feel guilt and shame before the objective moral law, that moral law cannot be an abstract moral principle. In other words, objective moral values must be ontologically grounded in a transcendent personality, before whom it is appropriate to feel moral guilt. So the very ontology of objective moral values and duties are personal in nature. Premise 3, if objective moral values and duties are personal, then they are grounded in a personal source. Premise 4, this personal source is what we call God. Now, it is more parsimonious to posit one entity which encompasses all of objective moral values and duties, rather than...
Same mistake. Between P3 and P4, there's a leap there. There's no logical connection between those two. And so he's left that out. I also point out that he's made another fundamental mistake as a debater here. He's spending all this time... he's, again, argument from authority. He's quoting people rather than just making the argument himself. Doesn't matter who said the argument. The argument either holds or doesn't. And so I'm going to respond to the argument. I don't care about the people he's naming. But the thing here is that he should have framed this. He should have personalized it to me, because he should know going into this that I am a moral realist, so he doesn't have to defend moral realism. And his syllogism should not be this generic syllogism that all my work is already refuted. He should be building a new syllogism that is designed to somehow overcome my arguments for moral realism. But this whole section has been built like completely separate, with like ignorant of what my whole position is on this. So it's like he's built it to argue for some sort of generic atheist that he's met on the internet, rather than tailored it for the opponent that he's facing, which would have saved us so much time. It would have saved him time, because he would have been able to pre-bunk, or at least attempt to pre-bunk what I'm going to say, right? Because he should know what my response to all this is. So he could have designed this argument more efficiently to sort of get around, basically get a lot of issues off the table and find where our common agreement is and focus in on what he and I actually disagree on and make the debate about that. That would have been an intellectually productive path. Instead, he completely ignores what my position on morality is. I can't even tell from this that he even knows what my moral philosophy is. And then he creates this sort of long, meandering, generic argument that has this fallacy here, which he would know to fix this if he had read my stuff on this, because he would know there's a problem skipping between P3 and P4, because in almost all atheist moral realism, the personal source is the moral agent themselves, right? So like, you don't need a God, you have a rational agent. They're right there. They're the person making decisions, right? So what I've shown in my work, and I cite it when I get to this point, but most recently is my religions article, which I mentioned a lot because it was the best warehouse and breadcrumb for people to go to, where I point this out is that, yeah, we are that personal agent. Morality is a property of personal beings, us, and in fact, any rational agents. In fact, for any rational agent in any universe, some moral facts will be true. It just will, and because it's a property of moral facts are a property of rational agents. So that's my view. There's many others, Smith and Philippa Foot, and I could go on. There's lots of other philosophers who Darwall and so on, who share this perspective, and he's completely blanking on that. He's just skipping right over it as if it doesn't exist. And again, he's facing the same problem with the mind, where he's saying that moral facts, like, this is the key premise. This is the premise that has to survive. Everything else is just song and dance. The premise he needs to preserve is that moral facts cannot, not have not, but cannot be reducible to natural properties. And he should know how I have already done this. And so he should have tailored this argument to somehow rebut me, right? But he didn't do that. He wasted time basically at this ultra basic, naive level, which gets easy to refute because all I got to do is present my theory that he already knew coming in, and it's automatically refuted everything he just said. So we'll get to that, I guess, later when we get to that part of it.
Rather than multiple ones. So we can simply posit objective goodness itself, which would encompass all values and duties, and that would be personal in nature. Therefore, God exists. Now, I fully expect my opponent will be able to come up with alternative explanations to the point I raised. But a major obstacle for him is offering an alternative explanation of reality that is more plausible and parsimonious. What I mean is I suspect he will have an alternative explanation for consciousness, for moral realism. I read his paper recently, and the contingency of the universe. But notice what will happen. He will be demonstrating theism is more parsimonious, because we can explain all of this data with one explanation. A fundamental mind exists, which explains why the universe exists, why consciousness exists, why moral realism exists, and many other aspects of reality I don't have time to cover here.
So, about his argument, according to which theism is a better explanation because it's more parsimonious. And but for instance, if you have a demonic theory about illnesses, for instance, natural explanation, you have for each disease a different explanation. Whereas, the supernatural explanation is way better because in each case you have only one explanation, which is Satan. Satan is causing the plague, cancer, viral infection, bacterial infection, and so on. And so, and for instance, I went to a birthday party with my nephew the other day, and the same thing happened here. On a supernatural view, all the tricks of the magician can be explained with magic. So, isn't magic a more parsimonious explanation? And so, shouldn't we let go of natural explanation? And we can even flip his argument. I found the epigraph of the origin of species, and it says, "But with regard to the material world, we can at least go so far as this. We can perceive that events are brought about not by insulated interposition of divine power exerted in each particular case, but by the establishment of general laws." And so we could say that under theism, you need divine interventions, different divine interventions for each of the items they list. Whereas if you posit natural law.
Yeah, well done. I was actually going to do this too if you hadn't done it. I was going to go, like, if you go back to your first one where everything is done by Satan, you could replace all the E1, E2 and stuff by just saying physics. Satan, physics. Isn't that simple? Physics explains all of it, right? So isn't physics better than Satan? Yeah. So what you're capturing here is the hidden violations of parsimony in this. So like really, God is not a simple theory because you're somehow extracting all this complex stuff, not just stuff that happens, but stuff that didn't happen. And you have to create this massively complex explanation as to why all of that and not other stuff comes from this one entity. And then it's an entity that you have no evidence for, and the entity itself is massively complicated. Far more complicated than physics when you get down to it. Like, physics gets reductively simpler as you go down. God does not get reductively simpler. So what you do is you get all these physical explanations. You have all the different diseases. They reduce to biochemistry, reduces to physics, reduces to quantum mechanics, right? Gets all the way down to there. And then you've got this really simple setup of quantum mechanics, and then suddenly you leap to the most complex thing imaginable, explaining the quantum mechanics is this God. Why do you need that? Why do you need to jump back to a super complex entity? Why can't you just stop with the quantum mechanics, which is the simplest so far you could get it? And then, of course, he would say but quantum mechanics is still complicated. Yeah, but it's a lot less complicated than God. And also, we have a lot of theories of everything that explain quantum mechanics that are even simpler still. And you say, well, we haven't scientifically proved those, but we haven't scientifically proved God either, right? So we're in the same boat. So now we're really actually comparing God with theories of everything that are below quantum mechanics and are at the edges of theorizing in physics where we haven't proven yet, just like God is at supposedly the edges of physics that we're theorizing and haven't proven yet. And so we're actually supposed to be comparing theories at those levels. We're not supposed to be comparing God with the vastly downstream effects of why he chose to create volcanoes that burn people alive, right? Like you've got all this stuff that you have to explain. And there's a lot of weird decisions he's making in terms of how to do that. It's really hard to explain that. Whereas you start with quantum mechanics and everything falls out. Like, why are minds dependent on physical brains, which are like super heavy and super easy to damage. They require a lot of energy and oxygen. They kill mothers in childbirth because of the bipedalism and a large cranium don't go together. And we don't lay eggs. And so like, it's all of these things that he's sort of skipping over, where actually his God theory is actually a really ridiculously complicated theory, but he's just stuffing it all into 3 letters, thinking that solves it, that makes it simple now. But if he's allowed to play that trick, then we can do the same thing with the E1s, E2s, and stuff, and just put physics. And in fact, we can just decide the letter P will represent physics, and then we actually have like a third of the letters of his, so ours is actually simpler because we can do it with 1 letter. And then he'll go back and say, well, I can do mine with G, so we both have 1 letter. It's like, okay, now what is behind those letters, right? Like let's compare the relative complexity of what's behind those letters. And that's the thing that he's skipping over here. So this is really bad argumentation. It's very naive. And the way you pointed out immediately, that would have been great if I'd had those slides. I would have loved to have used them. I'm really good at explaining this. I go at this differently because I didn't use slides in my presentation, but I do attack this directly in my opening because I'd already prepared for this, is that I had a whole model of how theism is actually complex. And we have much simpler theories. Even if they're just theories right now, they're not proven. It doesn't matter. God's not proven either. So we're on the same boat there. And so I take that as the direct assault. And so I stick with simplicity, precedent, evidence, and they keep it simple to those 3 things. And you'll notice when we get to that point, and in fact, I guess maybe we'll have to do a part 2 to cover the rest, that we'll get to that point where he and I go into it over this very question of what counts as simple. And he's very resistant to the realization that God is actually a very complex entity. And was very resistant also to the idea of hypothetical simple physical entities when he himself is proposing a hypothetical complex entity. Like, he's like, but you're just hypothesizing. I'm like, yeah, so are you. Right? Like there are those kinds of threads where he just wouldn't give, when of course any like intellectually serious, honest person would have admitted the fault there. Like, yeah, you're right. Okay. And then had to come up with some other argument to defend it. But that's not what, like, he tried to like push back against obvious conclusions at the end. But that's where this is going to end. We'll get to that. The battle of the simplicities will come up later in the debate.
Like other issues, for example. So theistic idealism has better explanatory scope, power, plausibility, is the least ad hoc. Unless my opponent can offer a simpler explanation that can account for all this data I presented, we will have to conclude that theism is the best explanation of reality until we can come up with more data. Now, my opponent has said on his blog that in articles like The Problem of Nothing and his reply on Kuhn's cosmology, that he thinks an absolute nothing brought about the universe. Not what Lawrence Krauss says, he's very clear about that, but in literal absolute nothing. He says in his blog post, Kuhn's Cosmology, whereas if you just let it go without any intelligent control, then a nothing will almost certainly collapse into something. That is absurd, though. That's like saying 0 + 2 = 1,000,000. It doesn't make any sense. To collapse into something, it has to be something. He's also said an actual nothing is therefore even more likely to randomly create rabbits and Death Stars, in his article, The Problem of Nothing, which is, of course, absurd. That doesn't make any sense. This is what he has offered as an alternative to theism, as an explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, I guess, or why the universe exists. But this is absurd. He will need to defend this tonight against a theistic proposal, show that is more plausible, more parsimonious, and in fact is logically coherent. Let's remember the Duhem-Quine thesis: no theory can be confirmed in isolation from its background assumptions. If that's one of his background assumptions, he'll need to defend that as a better explanation than theism. Thank you.
So it's strange, like he's trying to, he's sort of ridiculizing my theory, right? So he's straw-manning it by arbitrarily picking, like, I mentioned the word Death Stars once, and saying, well, he says that Death Stars could just appear. When actually I argue quite the contrary, or at least relevantly the contrary. And I get into that when we get to the thing. But the thing that's, like, the key point that's going on here is he only chose this prebunking. He didn't go against my moral argument. He didn't go against my mind-brain physicalism argument. And I have prominently argued these things, so like there's no reason why he couldn't have prebunked. So all of that time he wasted trying to quote authorities and stuff and burning clock on broken syllogisms and things, he could have just defended his premises for half his time, and then the other half of the time prebunked all of what he would then know are my answers to all of those arguments, that would have been a much better use of his time, and it would have been a much more superior opening, and would have created a much more challenging debate, because then I would have to do a lot more things to rebut him, because everything he said would have been relevant and substantive, and I would have had to have done something about it. So that's like the general problem with that. But notice what he does is he doesn't correctly describe my theory at all. He describes my conclusion, but not the argument, right? So he doesn't describe the argument. He just calls the conclusion absurd without explaining how it's absurd when I gave an argument for it. So like if the conclusion's absurd, there has to be one of the premises have to be absurd, right? So like what premises are you going to challenge and so on. So he didn't present the argument. He just sort of like mocks it and misrepresents it to make it look ridiculous. And that's his argument, which is a terrible way to argue, because especially when your opponent is about to walk up and explain the actual theory. so like you've been found out. You'll be found out. Like your attempt to misrepresent it. Now the whole audience is feeling cheated. They're going to say like, that's not what he said your argument was. Like, this sounds like a different argument, a more substantive argument. And he just bypassed it by making fun of it. That's a cheap play. That's not like serious intellectual discourse. And so I think that's one where it's just very obvious that he's playing a game here, rather than taking seriously, like, does he really want to take seriously what my argument is and try to argue the premises or the logic or something, like try to prove the argument false? And even if he's going to do that, he should be aware that a lot of those rebuttals are already addressed in the article he's talking about. So he does need to address the addresses, right? Like, so you can't just present rebuttals that are already refuted in the source, because then I can just say, I already refuted that in the source and drop mic, right? So like, if you're going to present the argument, you have to actually make an argument. And that's the thing. It didn't happen here. He just sort of creates an emotional effect on the audience. He doesn't present an actual argument against what my theory is. He doesn't even explain what my theory was. And then, of course, he mentions that I'm going further than Krauss, but he never realizes that, well, then that means he's obligated to refute Krauss as well, because if I'm wrong, now you have Krauss making a similar argument. Well, what's that argument, right? And you could go like to Sean Carroll, and then you could go to Guth, Vilenkin. Like, you could go through all these different Penrose. You could go through all these different models. If you're going to say that there are no simple models, you're just going to pick mine because you think you can mock it by misrepresenting it, but not admit that there are actually a bunch of really simple models. They all work, and they're all way simpler than your God. But he doesn't even mention it except to say that I reject Krauss. I don't exactly reject Krauss. That's an inaccurate phrase of it. I think we can go further than Krauss, but Krauss still has a model. And it's still simpler than God, and so you still have to like address it. You can't just say, oh, Carrier rejects Krauss, therefore we don't have to rebut Krauss, because I would immediately tell you, well, even if you refute me, that would just put Krauss back in the frame, so he might be correct, right? So if I'm wrong, Krauss is right. Or if Krauss is wrong, Carroll is right. Or Carroll, there's so many theories that you have to take on before you can say that we don't have one. And that's why that kind of argumentation is always a failure. And it's emotionally manipulative rather than intellectually serious. And that was kind of the most blatant example of that, where he's just using mocking. He's replacing argument with mockery, and that's not productive at all. Like, that's just a waste of everyone's time.
Yes, and I think that's essentially what he does for the rest of the debate. It will be interesting. I thought that there was another prebunking where he was trying to imply that if you were adopting a stance for parsimony, then you end up necessarily adopting solipsism, but I think it comes later in the debate.
Right,
so yes.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Or
That's right.
Theoretically, we'll get to that.
So that's it for the part one of the debate review. Once again, I massively respect people who have the physical courage to defend their ideas and prepare debates and so on. And so that applies to Mike Jones as well. But ultimately, I think most of his argument is quote mining, red herrings, and essentially confirmation bias and so on. So, and he wouldn't, as you said, Dr. Carrier, he wouldn't do that unless the goal was to manipulate the audience. So, yes. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome.
This is 10 minutes. I have the timer set for you, Mike, on your first word.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Carrier. I really appreciate that. I want to start out by saying I know I'm totally aware we have a limited time, so I would please press you to use that limited time to offer a better explanation other than just random possibilities. As I said in my opening statement, there are plenty of possibilities we could posit. Why is that a better explanation given the data? If we have different aspects of reality, merging of nature of the universe, contingency, consciousness, moral realism, can even throw in things like fine-tuning or reason, we can explain all that with theism. If we want to posit various different other possibilities, that would be actually conceding, because that's my point. You have to do that, and that just shows that you're not actually offering a plausible and parsimonious explanation.
This significant where he seems to have ignored 90% of my opening and is only responding to the superstring theory point. Which, and I'm also saying like that it's like he's missing the point that like he argued that there's no other explanation and I argued there is. And now he's changing the terms of the argument. He's moving the goalposts and saying, well, you can't just say a possible thing. It's like, yeah, that's what your argument was, that I couldn't say a possible thing. So I defeat that argument by presenting a possible thing. So now he's changing it to a probabilistic argument. It's like, why is superstring theory a more likely explanation than God? Which I actually did give some examples of why that is, especially in relation to mind-brain physicalism. But even in terms of like precedent, I gave some examples of why like this is a physical explanation. Physical explanations have precedent. I mentioned that there are scientists who actually can explain the whole standard model based on superstring theory. That's a prediction. You can't predict that with God. You can't predict how many quarks there should be or whatever, or what properties they should have, right? So I actually did do the thing that he claims I didn't do, but he just skipped over it and focused on my use of the word possible and my explanation of the role of modal arguments, and then just ran off with that and ignored all the refutation of his thing. So like he's trying to pretend that my entire opening was just a series of possibilities, which is not the case. There was only one possibility argument made in there, and I explained why it was a possibility argument. And he's not addressing the actual argument I made. He's not addressing why it was a possibility argument. And he's also not addressing the fact that I actually did make a probabilistic argument for it. It just wasn't as, like, the number of words in between the word possible and the forward and back of that just, I guess, was too many words for him to keep track of what that is. But anyway, so this looks very rhetorical. Like, this idea is he's just dismissing everything I said as mere possibilities. Well, sure, you can explain everything with physicalism, and that's just a possibility. And that isn't really what my argument was, so he's kind of like essentially ignoring the argument and sort of creating a straw man. And it's very rhetorically effective emotionally to an audience who might be lost at this point. It's like, oh, okay, so he said Richard just said it was possible, and that's not enough. Oh, wow, okay. But like, if you weren't paying attention, you would realize, wait a minute, that's not what Richard Carrier said. So this is an apologetical move. This isn't really like, this is more disingenuous than like real debate.
He said supernatural explanation is not an explanation. I want to rebut that by saying, could you define what natural and supernatural are? How do we distinguish this? Because I think there's a lot of gray in that, and these terms are not properly defined. He said physicalist philosophers have argued qualia can reduce to computational physics. I don't think I disagree. I'd like you to explain more on that. My point was that qualia does not reduce to a material substance. So if you have an idealist ontology, we experience qualia, which I would say could be reduced to information. Totally agree. Not a problem there. So I don't see that as really challenging what I said. You said minds can exist out of being complex machines, or they're complex evolved computers on your view. That needs to be justified. We just can't say brain, magic, therefore consciousness. We have the hard problem of consciousness for a reason. If you're going to posit a physical theory, you're not going to say consciousness is fundamental. You need to explain how it emerges. Okay. My argument is that it can't, and it's best explained as a personal explanation because of...
Here he did it. He just did it. You can't. He said you can't. It's not possible. But I did. So he skipped over that, right? I was ignoring it. I actually did provide evidence and reasons to believe in the computational model of qualia. I spent a lot of time on that, right? In fact, and so now he's saying you can't do that, but I just did it. And like 5 seconds ago, he said, well, I agree that you can do it. And now he's switched to you can't do it as his argument. So he's moving the goalposts from probabilistic to possible, right? From modal argument to an empirical argument. But I hit both, and he's ignoring that, right? So like, here he is again back to the modal argument, you can't do it, which is an argument that can easily only be refuted by just presenting a possibility. You don't need to present a probability. You're saying you can't. All I have to do is show I can. I don't have to show that the argument is probable to defeat that. But I also do that. I go the extra mile and show that it's also more probable and explain why that is. I even gave a detailed argument as to why the God theory does not explain mind-brain physicalism in terms of what we studied and know about the brain and stuff. I gave lots of examples, and he's just blown past them all and pretend that they don't exist and claim that you can't do that. And so, but I did do that. So clearly that argument is false. And then he still wants to push the empirical argument, which I also made, but he's not addressing any of the evidence. He's completely ignoring all the evidence I presented for this, and even like essentially implying to the audience that I didn't present any evidence, which is gaslighting, really, right? So like he's trying to convince the audience that they didn't hear what I just said, right? Like there's a whole content of my argument doesn't exist, didn't happen, nothing to see here, and that's the kind of thing, like in terms of debate like this, that really annoys me. It's one of the reasons why I hate debate, is because this shit. Like he's completely ignoring the argument and basically telling the audience that it didn't exist. And that's not an effective way to argue, right? Like it's effective emotionally, right? Like, but it's not effective rationally in terms of getting at the truth of things.
Because of issues like that, and because the very nature of consciousness cries out for a personal explanation. So we need more than just, well, it happened. I need actual data for that because there's no evidence that brains are actually generating consciousness. Correlation is not causation. We have correlations in the brain. Idealists predict that. Physicalists can predict that. That doesn't change anything. Now, we need to talk more about your whole worldview because you're trying to argue that naturalism is more probable given what we observe. I would argue that on your entire worldview, it isn't. You said in your article, Kuhn's Cosmology, you said this reifies the principle of indifference, but the reification is a logical necessary outcome of the state of nothing as described. It is the absence of all limits and controls. All logical possibilities are ontologically possible outcomes. And in the absence of anything rendering one outcome more likely than another, every outcome must necessarily be equally probable. In other words, because you are arguing from this nothing state, which you've not defended yet here, you have to say, and you've said, everything is equally probable. So how could you say the universe we observe is more probable on your worldview? It isn't. You've said everything is equally probable. So if everything's equally probable, nothing is probable.
Remind me, did he even make a cosmological argument in his opening?
Yes. Well, essentially, he was saying that his first argument was idealism, so all is mind, and then matter can't be the universe can't be reduced to any substance, and if you probe deep enough, you end up with properties that are more attuned to minds, and therefore the universe could be seen as emerging from a mind.
But I can't remember if he made the argument that atheists can't explain how the universe came about, right? Because he even says right here, like, oh, sure, you have explanations, right? It's just a possibility. The reason I asked that is it sounds like he had a prepared answer to an argument I did not make in this debate, right? Like he's arguing off book, right? He's talking fourth wall now. He's like arguing with some other argument I made somewhere else that did not come up in this debate. And I feel like that's evasive, right? Like, so he's avoiding the argument we're supposed to be having, which is the argument he presented, and then my rebuttal. We're supposed to be arguing that argument. He's he's bringing up a whole new argument and trying to argue against it. So now, like, he's putting me in the position where now I have to, like, catch the audience up and explain, well, what is he even talking about? What is this argument that you're talking about? So in a sense, like, he strawmans an argument that I didn't even present to the audience. And so now I have to go unstrawman that argument, which forces me to burn clock on something that I shouldn't have to do, because that isn't the argument that he presented in his opening. Like, this isn't the thing that we're supposed to be debating. He's like coming up with new things to debate, I think, because he didn't really have a reply to the things that we were debating about mind. He kind of ran out of things to say about that because they were not great logical arguments. But so anyway, he's bringing up this new thing, which is basically, it's almost like he's starting a new opening statement, and it's a meta argument because he's arguing against an argument that hasn't been presented, and he's not correctly presenting the argument that he's supposed to be rebutting because that wasn't brought up. And so it's just a mess at this point. Like, from a debate perspective, I think the audience is already confused. They have no idea what he's talking about. And that makes it more difficult for me in terms of clock time, that now I have to deal with this mess that he's made to try and explain to the audience what they're missing and what he's leaving out and so on. So this is bad debate style. Like, he really should just have engaged with my rebuttal to his argument and actually try to recover his argument. He didn't really. He kind of basically just avoided all the arguments that I made that were actually substantive. And so anyway, this is another thing that I find annoying. I mean, it's in terms of, like, yeah, I made this argument. If you're going to present it correctly, then we can debate that argument. That's fine. But I think in terms of the context of this debate, it's kind of really just an annoying thing to do. And I think frustrating for the audience as well to have done this.
Yes, I entirely agree. I think that you're absolutely right in that for the rest of the debate, it won't be an exchange of ideas. His tactic seems to be that, well, at the end of the opening statement, then I will try to corner my opponent by insisting on that article you wrote on your blog, according to which, if I oversimplify, something can come out of nothing, and he tries to insist on that. And yes, that's pretty clear in what follows.
Yeah, it's especially if this had been a cosmological debate, then that's an argument I would make. But I don't need, in a mere argument for God or against God, I don't actually have to bring in the nothing cosmology. I can use standard cosmologies to defeat the argument. So, but the fact that I hadn't even stated what my position is going to be in this debate, it's kind of silly for him to pick that one position. So now I have to explain, like, well, actually, there's like 5 different positions that are they're all more probable than God, and we could pick one of them and argue one of them if we want. But he's picking the one that he thinks that he can ridicule the most to the audience because it's easy to misrepresent it, and also pretend that this is an argument that I invented solely by myself, even though it has published scientific papers behind it and things like that. But nonetheless, that's where he's going with this. You know, you got to deal with what gets thrown at you in the debate. So I come back at this, but right now what he's presenting is something that's just out of left field, and the audience is kind of lost, I think, at this point.
So you can't say that on your worldview, the universe we observe is more probable. Now, he talked about, well, why did God design the universe this way and not another way? You can correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm misunderstanding you there. This flows out of two principles: the nature of God and axiology, which is the study of value. God is going to create value, things that are valuable. Bodies have value. Creating a universe that slowly evolves or slowly gets better has value. Creating creatures that can come to learn and study the universe has value in that. God is going to create value, analogous to...
I have to say, I find this argument absolutely dumbfounding. I mean...
It's circular. It's obviously circular.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's such a ad hoc. Yes, well,
it is a weird thing suddenly to come. Also, it's worth pointing out, like, he suddenly switched into this. It wasn't in his opening, and he was doing the nothing cosmology, but now he's segged immediately to this. I just don't know, like, what is he looking at on his note pages that are instructing him to do this? It's just a strange behavior. And yeah, as you point out, that this is a completely circular argument. I don't even know why we're wasting clock on it.
Yeah,
value, analogous to a author who creates various different worlds and stories. There are value in those. Some may be better than others, some are not. They're still creating value through those stories. God, who is perfectly good, would also want to increase value, and that is what he's doing. He's increasing value in how he's creating. We don't need to posit that he created a certain way or another way. Imagine if, like, to give an analogy, let's say we came across a crime scene, and there was a guy there. We found video footage of a murder in the room with him for an hour, and then he stabbed him and walked out. And we're like, well, we know a murder committed. It'd be absurd for us to say, no, because that couldn't have happened. The murderer could have created elaborate saw exercises from the movie, and puzzles and schemes, and tortured him. Why would he just have stabbed him? It doesn't matter. We may not know the intentions or the thoughts of that murder, but we know a murder happened. Likewise, we have evidence in this universe that God exists. We can point to it. So that still follows.
Now, see, that analogy is immediately self-refuting because he's the one arguing that an angel came in and killed him, right? Like, and so I'm like explaining that's very unlikely. Usually it's probably just going to be a person, right? Like the naturalist is on the right side of that analogy. He's on the wrong side of that analogy, which is, it's just a weird analogy to bring up. And then he segged from the whole creating value thing to authorship and things like that, where it does, like, he seems to be like just presuming his conclusion in the premise, but then he drops it. Like, he doesn't use that to explain, like, when I went through my opening responding to his, I gave him reasons why the evidence, like, if you want to do the knife in the room thing, why the evidence is more likely. Because he's trying to dismiss that first part where he's trying to dismiss the idea, well, you can't predict how God would create, he's just creating value or whatever. But that's a non-specific prediction. And that's the problem probabilistically, is that from that, you cannot predict that God, like, what would be more valuable? A human, people whose brains can't be injured and so they always have reliable judgment, right? Or they don't need to consume more resources to keep a brain alive when they've got a mind, an empty mind that can do it, a soul that can do it. There are things that God could do that would actually be better and create more value if you're going to make this argument, right? I don't put it in that phrase. I put it in just as what can you predict from your model? Mm-hmm. If you say, oh, God creates value, you can't predict that there be brains rather than souls controlling the body. Like, that's exactly my point. So he's really just repeating my point, thinking that somehow this is rebutting my point. In fact, it's just, that's my point, is you can't predict this from that. Whereas absolutely 100% you can predict that if naturalism is true and we exist, brains are machines, or complex evolved machines, and that's what the evidence shows. They're evolved, complex machines, etc. So, like, he's not addressing the actual argument. He's presenting arguments that are really self-refuting if you think about it, right? Like, he's really just supporting my point against him. But I don't think the audience gets that, because, like, you would have to notice what's going on in terms of, but since he's changing subjects so suddenly and building these weird concepts so rapidly, I don't think the audience can follow what he's doing. Like, why did he suddenly switch into this argument? I can figure out, like, what the 3 or 4 steps of reasoning is going on as to why suddenly he's talking about, well, you can't predict. He's trying to get rid of my prediction model, right? Not successfully, but that's what he's trying to do. But I think the audience is lost at this point. They don't know, they haven't caught up. They don't know what he's doing. And so I think in terms of like trying to defend his side, this is bad form. Like, someone could have done much better than this. This is not the best way to defend his side.
Yeah, I think the axiology thing comes after you presented the fact that conscious agents in our universe emerge only after 3.5 or 4 billion years of evolution. And I think what he's basically saying is that, isn't that better that we had to wait that long until it would have been less valuable if conscious agents had just popped up out of nowhere.
Like Genesis describes. So like Genesis describes the non-valuable way of doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't want to put words or thoughts in his mouth. Like he didn't actually say that. So I don't know what would happen if we cornered him on that. But it's a circular argument because he's not making a predictive case for it. He's just declaring it. Like, well, I just think that it would be more valuable this way. Mm-hmm. But why? And like, could you have predicted this from that? Like if you were godlike and had, infinite wisdom and abilities, is this what you would do? Like, can you predict it? You can't really, because God doesn't have a physical mind. And if he's going to make us in his image, we shouldn't have a physical mind. Like, we should work the same way God's mind does, right? That's what you would predict from that model, for sure. But certainly, even if you say you can't predict, well, now you're still leaving the probability low, whereas it's 100% on naturalism. 100% beats every other probability. So, like he's not making the argument for his case here. He's actually helping my case by showing that God does not predict this thing, whereas my model does.
So again, I didn't say we need God to explain qualia. That was a first initial argument arguing for idealism. So idealism is what I was basically positing. That what we see in terms of qualia, there's no need to posit a physical substance beyond the mind, is my point. A second substance. I'm not a substance dualist, I'm an idealist. All is mind. So I would call myself a dual aspect idealist. You posited superstring theory. Well, that's highly speculative. Physicist Tom Hartsfield has published a lot of articles arguing that string theory is circling the drain. He said this in 2014. It's riddled with problems.
That's
but even
10 years old. So he picked some random guy slagging off string theory from 10 years ago. It is one of the dominant theories today still, right? Like there's thousands of papers a year, probably hundreds of thousands, but certainly thousands of papers a year by string theorists. It is the leading theory, actually. So this is a deep misrepresentation of the audience. He's claiming, superstring theory is a dead theory. No one believes this. This one guy that I'm not going to explain why he knows anything and why we should listen to him said it was circling the drain. But it's like 10 years ago he says this. But what about today? What's going on today? Who are the leading people today? We're going to go look at like polls of physicists, which we have to answer that question. It's not going to go his way. So he's trying to get superstring theory to disappear, but he's not doing it in an honest way. And so that's apologetics right there, where your goal is not to tell the audience the truth. Your goal is to make uncomfortable truths go away, right? Your goal is to defend your position regardless of the truth, even against the truth. And so that's what's happening here is we have this rhetorical device. I'm going to cite a random authority, obsolete authority. That's a very typical apologetic thing to do, 10 years old, who cherry-picked to like make a thing go away, and then I'm going to move on. And that's not real debating. That's evasion again. So this apologetics is very evasive in that way and dishonest, I think. So this is more stuff that kind of annoys me in debates, and why I hate debates is because people do this kind of stuff. They're not taking it seriously. They're not actually engaging with the realities, the facts being presented, or the reality of current state of science, for example.
Problems. But even if string theory turns out to be true, this isn't a challenge to my view, because string theory would be a scientific theory, not a metaphysical theory, or hypothesis, if you want to use that term. Okay? Could be perfectly posited. Like, we need to actually show that the strings themselves refer to an actual underlying physical substance. So we have that problem there. Well, I'm going on what we actually have, though, which is in quantum field theory. And as of now, we have no reason to posit some sort of underlying substance there. It's just information at the bottom point, which would align more with an idealist perspective, and specifically a theistic idealist perspective.
In my opening, I mentioned that I don't think I used specifically the word information, but that the mathematical functions refer to physical realities. And so there is no information without physical manifestation of it, right? So information doesn't have any power by itself. You have to have a physical structure. Information is just a way of describing the properties of that structure that make it different from other structures, and that's it. So I already rebutted this. So by ignoring my actual rebuttal, he's just basically just sort of gainsaying. He's just sort of repeating the same argument that I already refuted as if I hadn't done so, knowing that the audience is probably lost at this point and doesn't realize that this is a already refuted argument, that this is not a pickup, this is a repeat of a drop. So that this is not like good debating here. Like if you're going to pick up a drop, you really need to actually have an argument that responds to the last argument. You can't repeat the previous argument that was already refuted. That does not score. There's no professional debating society that would let you score with that. So this is like a fundamental failure in debate technique.
Now, to be clear, many of the physicists I quoted, I'm not saying they're theists. I'm saying the implications of what they're saying, though, better aligns with theism. So again, if there is some sort of underlying physical thing that explains all of reality, then we need evidence for that. And then we also need to know why it is non-sentient. if the underlying foundation of reality is able to create a complex universe, it can't be acted upon. It has to somehow act on its own to bring about the universe. It sounds an awfully lot like God. That's my point. And of course, we talked a little bit about the quantum cognition correlation. To recap, gave a couple different points here. Actually, it was the Franco-Vazza and Felitti argument that we see the way the brain is similar to the cosmic web of galaxies. Now, Vazzo and Felitti are basically saying that, Bruno Castro by extension, saying that, look, idealism says the brain or the body is just the emergent picture of what you look like as a conscious agent. If you're in a physical space-time, you look like something, it's going to look like a brain or you by extension. Likewise, if idealism is true and the universe emerges from a mind, the brain itself would be the physical appearance in the same way your brain is a physical appearance of you. Now, in response to that, he said it's arranged in the most efficient way. Well, I mean, there are many ways to arrange efficiency. We have created very complicated computers and now quantum computers that are not arranged in the way our brains are arranged. So network efficiency is not necessary in the current way that our brain are designed.
There's so many things wrong there. First of all, quantum computers are not efficient. They're like some of the most inefficient, energy inefficient, organization inefficient. There's a hope that they could be more efficient, but the scientists have been struggling to get quantum computers to do anything but the cheesiest, smallest amount of stuff with the most incredibly elaborate apparatus. So no, quantum computers are not a good example of this. But also, he's blowing past evolution here. Like neither of us, I briefly mentioned, I dropped evolution as evidence in my opening, but he's basically blowing past evolution, like the evolutionary reason why the cerebral cortex is shaped the way it is and organized the way it is. So there's two stories here. There's one is the biology, like the biological pathways, the sort of what you call lock-in. There's only certain ways that it can do it. So that we know that story. We know why the brain is organized the way it is and physically made out of neurons and why glial cells are important. Like we know this, we know all this, right? Like he's just blowing past that. The other reason is that to do the kinds of things our brains do, and this is in all of the brain science literature in terms of the organization of consciousness, go back to Bayesian reasoning, it is doing a complex neural net Bayesian computation to sort of model the world. And that requires a certain kind of connection, ways of connecting things that are called a neural net, which we now have, and famously people are using to sell AI slop with, right? So like so actually we do have that, right? Like so it actually is the same organization as the brain. The only reason that it's physically different is because we're running on silicon Turing machines. We're running software on these silicon Turing machines. It's just that's another evolutionary story of the lock-in in terms of how we built our technology. We could have done it in the same way as the brain. It just wouldn't have been as easy for us in terms of doing that because we don't have millions of years to figure that out. So anyway, like he's just blowing past the whole causal history of all these things to make an argument that because he's ignoring all of the evidence in terms of why these things are the way they are, that therefore the brain can't be a computer or it can't be the most efficient organization. We're talking thermodynamically efficient organization because there are other efficient organizations, but that is a non sequitur in this context. It's a non sequitur in multiple ways. I mean, one is it doesn't have to be if there's 10 different ways to do it, as long as it's one of them, it meets my condition, right? Like there's no way that there are others is an argument against it being one of them, right? Like that isn't even a valid argument. But also the idea of ignoring the causal story of why it is the way it is another non sequitur and so on. So, I mean, this is just kind of like word salad almost at this point.
So we need another reason as to why the structure is the way it is and why it resembles mind. Just being at network efficiency, I agree. Now I want to ask, why does the universe on a godless view have to have network efficiency? What's the point of that? This is an arbitrary assumption. This is another brute fact being posited here. Whereas it's theism, as I pointed out, we're positing a far less brute facts, which is important. So again,
which isn't true, by the way. It's a very convoluted argument that he hasn't explained why God needed to make brains to make minds.
Exactly, yeah.
But now he's relying on that as the reason why God made the universe look like a brain, but he's not explained why God would need to make the universe look like a brain. And he's not addressed the point that I made that it doesn't actually resemble a brain in key respects. So like the argument here is just a mess. And it's really difficult when you're sitting here, like I'm sitting there trying to make notes as to how to reply. Like I'm struggling to even articulate what his argument is, much less be able to respond to it. And so that makes it a bit of a challenge in a debate like this. It's like, what are you even arguing? I don't even see the logic here at this point. Because at this point, he's just sort of off the cuff. He doesn't have a slide to show where I can see a syllogism and I say, oh, okay, I see where your mistake is. Right here, I'm like, now I have to like figure out, okay, you just gave me word salad about this. I can't even see a structured argument in there. I don't understand what it is that you're even saying. And so I can get to a point where I can kind of get it. But then it's like, now I have to unpack it just to explain why it's wrong. And so it's difficult to do notes on this. At some point, like maybe I'll just make a single notation, just make this point, it'll cover all the other points. So it's very difficult to try and diagram his argument live like this, because I don't see this kind of weird argument coming.
Important. So again, what I'm arguing is I'm saying that on theism, we have a well-rounded explanation that can account for multiple lines of data, as I presented in my opening statement, and it's a very simple and parsimonious explanation. Now, he did talk about simplicity. He might get to a specified complexity argument coming up. If he does that, though, he's going to have to take that to its logical extreme and posit solipsism. Because why posit beyond himself complex minds when he could just posit them as figments of his own mind's imagination? Sometimes positing complexity is necessary. For example, physicists posit a multiverse to explain fine-tuning. That is vastly complex to just explain the fine-tuning. So
that's another false thing. So this is a common apologetic argument. It's completely false. So he's got to know it's false. So I kind of think this is lying at this point. So when he says we just posit a multiverse, no one does that. All the multiverse theories fall out of existing cosmologies, like eternal inflation, which is the most popular Big Bang model today. Multiverses are an inevitable. They just fall out of that. They're inevitable. You don't posit it. They're entailed. And they weren't even trying to do that, right? You're just trying to explain observations, and they ended up with a theory that explains observations. And guess what? That theory entails that there's going to be a multiverse. And all multiverse theories today, like many worlds hypothesis, you could pick all of the black hole cosmology, all of them. They're an inevitable product of a simpler theory that explains observations. They're not just a posit. We don't just posit infinite multiverse. Therefore, we're creating an ad hoc, infinitesimal ad hoc probability. That isn't what's going on here. That's a complete misrepresentation. And by this point, 10 years ago, I could see someone maybe misunderstanding this. But by now, the literature is so vast and so clear on this that I cannot see any possible way that he believes what he just told the audience. He's got to know that he just lied to the audience and misrepresented the facts of the case. Which is disturbing to me, because how can you have a debate with someone who's not even going to tell the truth? Even when they know the truth, they're not going to tell it to the audience. It's one of the reasons I think debate has decayed to the point of being useless, but we talked about that last time.
So just positing complexity is not wrong. We have to posit something that accounts for all the data. And sometimes we have to posit things that are more complex. This is why we got quantum mechanics. Newtonian physics wasn't accounting for all the data. We had to come up with something else. Physicists posit a multiverse. Why? Because of complexity, fine-tuning that needs explained. So we need to have an explanation that accounts for all the data. And I would say, given the data, the best explanation is a mind. And I can argue that the mind itself, from philosophers like Richard Swinburne, Dr. Joshua Sijuwati, actually has a very simple ontology. Again, it's just perfect being theism. We don't have to posit complex parts, because the mind is not composed of physical parts. So it's actually a much simpler explanation. And I hope we get more into that, because there's more I want to talk about. Finally, you said consciousness is a process. Question, who am I talking to? How's that different than talking to a river or an avalanche? So consciousness.
That's a great point in his presentation. If brains are just physical processes, then how is it different to talk to a river? Yes. He's not really respecting the audience here.
No. And I can't believe that he doesn't understand the position. So this is another example of, this looks like deliberate rhetoric. It's gaslighting the audience. It's not being serious.
Avalanche. Consciousness, if you're just processes, this is a meaningless conversation. There's no agents here. He brought up the Izod problem, but he only talked about hypothetical imperatives. Yeah, no one denies that hypothetical imperative can be explained naturally, but we're talking about moral oughts.
I'm so glad he said that. That saved me a lot of clock time. When they admit that, it's gotcha now. Okay, so you let it in the door. The cat is in the door. It's in the house. You can't get it out now. Yeah, when they admit that hypothetical imperatives are physically explicable, empirical, they don't require a god or anything like that, then you've got them, because you can build a whole moral theory out of that. He's trying to claim that you can't, but that's what we'll get to later.
And you can't get around that. This is why I brought up the open question argument, because I can just ask, why is something natural good? And this also doesn't account for the argument I gave, which is that when we look at the very ontology of moral values and duties, objective goodness, it's personal in nature, which is what we call God. So why would the very ontology of moral values and duties appear to be personal and not also be God? It doesn't. It seems like, again, we need another ad hoc explanation to account for that. But I think I'm out of time, so I'll just yield the last few seconds. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll just add to that last remark that doesn't make a whole lot of sense either, because you're talking about a system that serves the interests of personal agents, us. Why would it be personal? Yeah, us. We're persons. We don't need another person to explain why we have systems designed to help persons that are engineered for persons. Yeah, that's we are persons. So yeah, that's another example where he skips over the obvious alternative explanation, which again, he's read my blog, so he knows what the alternative is. So that seems like trickery to me. Like he's not granting. He should know what's coming. and not pretend that it's not, right? Anyway, so that would be my last thought about that. There are other points, obviously, that we could have interrupted. There were like lots of non sequiturs and assertions and stuff throughout that whole rebuttal, but of course, my obligation in the debate is to try and hit as many of those as possible under clock, which is difficult to do. Difficult to even keep track of them because there's so much word salad in there, and then to actually do that and then do it under clock, because now I have to unpack and explain things and give science background before even getting to the response, and that's a whole lot of clock time to burn on those things. So I have to be judicious and decide which things am I going to drop because they're not that important, and which ones do I need to spend time on. And you have to do that on the fly, right? Because there's no break here. I have to get up immediately and figure that out. It's not easy to do, even for me after all these years of experience.
Yes, well, that's a very difficult exercise, as you mentioned. And so, yes, so that's it for our debate review. Again, yes, difficult exercise, especially when you come up against such perplexing arguments. But you've done quite a good job. I also mentioned that you did a written review of the debate, which is available on your blog, richardcarrier.info. And thank you again, Dr. Carrier, for your time. That was
you bet.
That was fantastic to have you once again on the channel. And as always, thank you for tuning in and listening to the podcast.